sessions leading up to this particular session, right? We've had some sessions to sort of highlight and outline different political approaches and opinions from, dare I say, somewhat extreme ends of the spectrum of the Israeli political spectrum, the left, the right, trying to understand the implications and how all of this comes into fruition, specifically with regards to what is now, it'll be the fourth election in just a few years. So, we're thrilled to have you here with us to share with us your expertise and your insights on the chaos and what to expect in the coming weeks, in the coming months, based on everything we've learned and we've heard so far. So please, Gabi, take us away.
Okay, great. Hi, everyone. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Gabi Mitchell. I'm originally from Providence, Rhode Island. So you can tell from my accent, English is my native language. And I made Aliyah in 2005, spent most of the last 15 years in Israel, but took a 4-year hiatus in Washington, D.C., where I was working on my PhD in government and international relations. And I work as the director of external relations for an institute called Mitvim, which is an institute that focuses on Israeli foreign policy issues. So my weekly schedule over the last week included Zoom sessions, because obviously the pandemic is still going on across the world, but Zoom sessions with people in Cyprus, partners in Turkey and in Bahrain, and in Europe as well. As an institute, we try to work very hard to identify potential partnerships with institutes both in the Middle East, Europe, and elsewhere. And I both partake in a lot of the meetings and focus primarily on energy policy issues, but you can't really talk about international relations without talking about domestic politics and understanding domestic politics as well. And I'm really glad to be here today to kind of talk about where Israel is just 2 days before Election Day. And as Rabbi Dorish mentioned, this is the fourth election in 2 years' time. So I've prepared a little bit of a slide. I'm going to keep my comments short, and you'll see on the slide, which I'm happy to share with anyone who's interested afterwards, there are some nice pictures and some other information, but I'll keep my comments short because I'd like to engage in conversation, take your questions. If you've already heard 2 speakers before me, then hopefully you have a lot of questions about what's going on in Israel right now. I hope to be able to answer some of them, but I can't promise that I'll be able to answer all, but I'll try my best. Beth or Rabbi Dorish, if you just don't mind giving me co-host responsibilities, that way I'll be able to share the PowerPoint with everyone.
You should have it.
All right. Perfect. Thank you so much.
Of course.
One of the things that I think is really important to kind of frame here, right, is we're not only a few days before the elections, but we're also a few days before the Pesach holiday. And so I like to, whenever I put anything together, I like to create something that is thematic. And what's better than the theme of Manish Tanav, right? What is making this election different than all of the previous elections? I hope to clarify why this is different, but I'm not actually sure. So let's see, and the results will tell us more in a few days. But why are we here? As is probably known by most of you, we had a very narrow Netanyahu-led government in November of 2018. That government collapsed, triggering early elections. And part of the reason why there were early elections was because of these police investigations into Prime Minister Netanyahu and the concern that the sitting prime minister would be indicted and under trial during the course of his candidacy, which is unprecedented and was of concern to a lot of Israelis, but also individuals within the political system. former IDF Chief of Staff Benny Gantz and Yair Lapid formed a party called the Blue and White Party in order to run on a anyone but Bibi ticket. And so there were 3 consecutive elections in April 2019, in September 2019, and in March of 2020. And every single election produced no clear winner and no path to a coalition government. And I'm going to talk in a couple of minutes about what I mean by a coalition government and how Israeli politics function. But each election over the last 2 years has produced no winner. And as a result, because of the Israeli system, if there's no winner, then you go on to the next election. But in March, or late March of 2020, Benny Gantz decided, even though I've run on a ticket of anyone but Bibi, I'm going to create a unity government with Netanyahu, and we're going to try to tackle the coronavirus pandemic and all of the issues facing the country as a result of the pandemic. And so they joined a unity government, and the unity government was about as dysfunctional as a unity government could be. Disagreements over the budget, disagreements over dealing with COVID, disagreements over how to deal with various strategic and national security issues. And as a result, by December, just a few months ago, the government had run its course and early elections were once again called, which is why we're calling this the 4th election, because nobody really considers the government that came into existence a year ago to actually really be a functional government. And so in 2 days' time, on the 23rd, we are going to have elections. Now, how do elections operate in Israel? Anybody over the age of 18 can vote. We have a parliamentary system, and the parliament, or the Knesset, is usually for a 4-year term, but spoiler alert, it rarely goes the distance, in large part because Israel's system is a multi-party system, which means that rather than in the United States, where you vote for one of 2 parties, maybe you vote for an independent party, but historically, at least at the national level, independent parties have not been successful. But a multi-party system, you can have as many as 12, 15, or at one point in Israel's history, 18 parties within the parliament itself. And so with such a fragmented political system, it increases the volatility, the internal volatility of the government, and increases the probability that the Knesset term doesn't reach 4 years. In fact, the average is 2.2 years, which is pretty low for any political system, in particular Israel's. Now, it's proportional representation. And what does that mean? It means that, first off, there are no districts, counties, states. It's just one voting block. Every voter has one vote, and all of those votes are equal. At the end of election day, when all of the votes are tallied, the number of Knesset seats a party earns is proportional to the number of votes it receives in the national tally, divided by the number of seats in the Knesset, which is 120, okay? If a party does not get past the electoral threshold, which in Israel is 3.25%, then all of those votes go to waste. And the proportion of seats in the Knesset is redistributed based on the number of votes that go to parties that enter the Knesset. So it's really important for your party to get over 3.25%. If not, that vote, it goes essentially in the waste bin. When the elections are completed, the goal of, let's say, the largest parties is to try to create a coalition of 61 seats or more. If you have 61 seats, you have a majority, you can create your government, and everybody can move on with their lives. But if none of the parties can create a coalition of 61 or more seats, then you're going to another election, which has never happened in Israel's history up until the last 4 elections. So even though there is volatility in the Israeli system, even though there are certainly flaws and no democratic system is perfect, we've never faced this or experienced this process up until now, and we've now experienced it almost 4 times in a row, pretty unprecedented. Voter turnout, despite the imperfections in the Israeli system, and despite the fact that This is the fourth election in 2 years. Voter turnout is generally pretty high in Israel. In the last election, it was 71.5%. And there's no indication up until now the voter turnout this year is going to be decidedly lower than it has been in the past. So voter turnout is really significant, and we'll see how it goes in a few days. Now, Israel's a rich history of electoral politics. They're usually the focal point of political narratives and ideologies that define a lot of Israelis. Some of the most important figures in Israel's history have used elections as essentially a stage to project their voice and their influence upon the Israeli public. But what are the major issues this year? What are the issues that are going to be driving voters when they enter the voting booth and have to pick up a piece of paper and put it in a box? Well, first, like anybody in the world, COVID, the coronavirus pandemic, is on everybody's minds. It's affected Israel's economy, and because of the fact that Israel hasn't had a functional government, Israel hasn't been able to update its fiscal budget since 2018, and there's unprecedented unemployment, largely due to the fact that Israel's tourism industry has not recovered in any kind of way in the last year. But there are other sectors of certainly of the Israeli economy that have also suffered and have not been resuscitated yet. There are public health questions. There are questions about the vaccine rollout, which Israel has done remarkably well, but at the same time, there are large portions of the population that have not been vaccinated, including Israel's ultra-Orthodox community. And so there are political debates and disputes between the largest party, the Likud party, and opposition parties about how the government has managed the COVID crisis. There are also disputes between all of the parties over foreign affairs, over relations with the United States, over the pending Iran deal 2.0, maybe, over how the Syrian civil war should be dealt, and how Israel should address normalization with its new Arab neighbors like the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Morocco, etc. But bottom line is, this is the fourth election in 2 years, and the previous 3 elections have been about Netanyahu. This fourth election is not going to be all that different. It's about Bibi. It's about whether you believe that Bibi Netanyahu has the leadership qualities and the personal characteristics to continue to be the prime minister, or whether you believe that a prime minister who is sitting in a courtroom can't effectively be the prime minister of the country at the same time. That is what it's going to be about. All of the other issues are kind of just, framed within that conversation of Bibi or no Bibi. And Israeli politics are colorful and creative. And of course, there are a lot of really inventive ad campaigns that have come out in this election, just like in previous elections. And for those of you who are interested, I'm happy to forward some of the videos that have gone viral over the last couple of weeks. But the bottom line is that there are 4 core messages, and these images kind of capture them. One has been the message of a new hope, that there are new leaders who want to take over the reins for Bibi Netanyahu. They want to lead the country in a new direction. Another has been the question of religion and state, right? There are major divisions within Israeli society about issues of religion and state between the ultra-Orthodox community and communities that are very, very secular, and rare small communities that are in between. But debates over religion and state continue to dominate the national discourse, even though, excuse me, the election is about Bibi. There's also a question about the female presence in Israeli politics. This ad right over here in the top right corner is about this male individual borrowing off of the famous wartime slogan of the United States, that this individual is going to vote for the only female party leader, Merav Michaeli, and the Labor Party, right? And of course, above all, Israelis have been inundated by this wonderful woman and the advertisements by the Knesset Election Committee reminding voters that all of the voting booths are going to be safe and protected from the outbreak of disease, right? There are 3 main challengers, and I'm about to wrap up, 3 main challengers who are hoping to dethrone Bibi Netanyahu. You have Yair Lapid of the Yesh Atid party, a center-left party. He's been in politics for about a decade. You have Gideon Sa'ar, a former Likud minister who had created a new party called the New Hope, and he is also hopeful that his center-right party will dethrone Bibi. And you have Naftali Bennett, former chief of staff of Netanyahu's office, former defense minister, and a right-wing political figure. All three of these individuals think and hope that they can overthrow Netanyahu. But, and I'm about to show you some of the polling statistics, the reality is none of these three individuals or their parties will get enough seats to unilaterally defeat Bibi Netanyahu. And they've spent much of their time, not all of their time, but as much of their time attacking Bibi as they have attacking one another. Classic. And this has been a big part of Netanyahu's successful strategies for the last couple of years, is dividing and conquering, finding the issues that split the opposition forces against him. Here are the final polls. These are a lot of numbers, so I'm going to break them down for you. These are the final polls from 6 independent polling agencies, all on March 19th, so Friday, the final day in which polls could be taken before Election Day. You have the sources here. You have the date, the number of respondents, varying degrees, some of them more, some of them less. And these are the results for all of the parties. And I've made it simple here. This is the average of all the polls down over here. Netanyahu's Likud party, the largest party by a wide margin with 31 seats, followed by Yair Lapid's Yesh Atid, Naftali Bennett's Yamina party with 9, and the New Hope party with 9. And because I know that sometimes numbers and math are scary, they scare me as well, I've created graphs. And in these graphs, you can see 2 different colorings. One is the Netanyahu block of 60, maybe 60 seats. And here is the anti-Bibi block of 48 seats. And these 2 parties here, the Joint List and Ram, those are Arab parties, which traditionally have never been invited to be a part of the government. So they sit outside of the government. So, like I said, you need 61 seats in this situation in which Bibi maybe convinces a party leader to join him. Nobody has 61 seats. And in this situation, in which all of the opposition leaders decide we're all going to gang up together and we're not going to join Bibi, in this scenario, no one has 61 seats. So at the very least, according to the polling data, we are looking at a very high probability of there being no clear winner. Now, no clear winner doesn't mean that there won't be a government. It just means that the wheeling and the dealing will have begun. There are some campaign observations, and I want to share a couple of them with you. First is that the polling data over the last couple of months has been really, really consistent. Does that mean that polling data can be trusted? Not exactly. All the polls that I showed, all the polls that I showed have a margin of error of anywhere between 4.4 to 5%. And if you look at some of these small parties over here that are tallying around 4 or 5 seats, 4.4 and 5% margin of error could be the difference between entering the government and exiting the government. And so the fate of the small parties could play a really, really big deal in the election results. And that's part of the reason why Netanyahu and some of the opposition parties are trying to lift up the spirits of the little guys, because they know that their fate is dependent on some of the smaller parties entering the government. They need them to enter the Knesset. They don't need them to do too well, but they need them to enter the Knesset. Otherwise, those votes all go to waste, and the seats are redistributed, right? There's been a slight uptick for Likud, but as I mentioned, there's no clear majority. There's an extreme lack of female leadership in this election. Most of the party leaders are male. Only one party leader, Merav Michaeli, featured here, the head of the Labor Party. She's the only female party leader There are a number of female number twos in a lot of the parties, but this has been a very male-dominated election campaign. There's a big question of whether parties or politicians could be wooed by Netanyahu and by Likud after election day. It's happened before, it could happen again. If he's at 60 seats, can he just convince one member of Knesset to switch sides? Now that might sound traitorous, but it's happened in Israeli politics before. So that can happen. A party could lose one individual if they don't stand their ground, if they don't have that kind of internal cohesion. And so there's one of the biggest questions out there is really whether there will be a fifth election. So what's going to come next? For the next 2 days, there's going to be something Israelis call Gewalt, which of course sounds like Yiddish, but it's Israeli for getting out the vote. All of the party leaders are going to be making calls. They're going to be on TV. They're going to be using every trick and traditional Jewish guilt in the book to get people to go out and vote, because the votes are going to matter. And a difference of just one party getting in or another party getting out will make the difference in this election. Election day will be March 23rd, and there's going to be a lot of overreacting the day afterwards, but that's when the real parliamentary aspect comes in, because probably won't be a clear winner. And then it's going to be up to the parties to wheel and deal and see what's possible and see what's not possible. And then we're going to see the real truth about, whether the campaign statements match the reality. And all of the parties are going to essentially offer to the president, Ruvi Rivlin, right over here, their recommendations for who should receive a mandate to build a coalition. And whoever receives that mandate will have a month. And then after that month, if they fail, then another party might get a month. And so it's quite possible that we won't know what Israel's government looks like till the end of May. And it's quite possible that at the end of May, we will be told we're going to elections again. See you in September, right? Literally everything is on the table. So I'm going to wrap up with that, and I'm going to open it up for questions. I put in a lot of information in a short conversation, but obviously there's stuff that I left out and questions that you may have based on your experiences with the speakers of the last 2 weeks. If I was to say this in a final note, it would be that it's going to be a very, very tight election. Not only tight in terms of the race itself, who could possibly get to 61 seats, but also tight in terms of the intensity and the emotions. 4 elections in 2 years can polarize a country. And I do think that in some regards, Israeli society right now feels very polarized. It's more important that Israel has a government in some regards than what the government is. A fifth election would be incredibly costly financially, but also politically, it would be very costly. So I think that the majority of Israelis want there to be a government. They want this cycle to be over. But what that'll look like and how we'll get there is a question that can only be answered in the future. Because of the Pesach holiday, there's a really good chance that we don't even know what the true statistics of all of the seats are for the Knesset until the middle of next week, because some of the parties are going to say we need to wait for all of the final votes to come in, the votes that are being counted by the army, right? We need to wait for the votes that are coming in from the diplomatic community. And so until all of those votes are tallied, it could be a margin of error, very, very, very small for some of those small parties. Israelis who live abroad cannot vote, but Israeli government, by order of the Supreme Court, has now opened the airport up for all traffic after about a month and a half, almost 2 months of the airport being almost completely closed. And so a lot of Israelis, I know a fair number of them, who traditionally would fly in for election day are making plans so they can come back in time to vote in 2 days' time. And with that, I'll conclude, and hopefully you'll have some questions that we can talk a little bit.
Morris.
Only one question. What are the possibilities of one of the Arab parties getting into the government?
So, as I said, there's never been an Arab party that sat within the government. Now, there are Arab parties and Arab members of Knesset. As I said, you have the Joint List and Ram. Those parties have sat in the Knesset for several years. But whether they will sit in the government, we've never seen that before. There is a possibility, and this has happened in the past, where government receives less than 61 seats, but an Arab party will support that government from outside of the government. So even though the government hasn't received 61 seats, the support, outside support that it gets from an Arab party allows it to go over the threshold. It's possible that could happen, but I don't see an Arab party joining the government this year, despite the fact that this year is a little interesting in terms of how the larger, more traditional Israeli parties or Jewish Israeli parties have conducted outreach to Arab voters. In the past, as early as 5 years ago, Netanyahu famously called out on election day that the Arabs were being bussed in droves to the polling stations in an effort to kind of rally his base and get people to go vote as well. This year, Netanyahu has spent a lot of his time on the campaign trail meeting with the Arab community, both in the north of the country and the south of the country, producing election campaign ads in Arabic. And there's a sense that perhaps Arab voters are less determined to cast their vote for one party or another party than they have been in the past. And certainly there's an argument out there that perhaps Israel's normalization agreements with countries like the UAE and Bahrain have caused something of a shift within Arab Israeli public opinion. But we'll see what the results are. If an Arab party was invited to be a part of the government, that would be a historic first. Yeah.
So,
Thanks.
David.
yeah,
David and Elliot. Okay. Go ahead, David.
I'm wondering, with all this mishigas that surrounds the Israeli election, why do they have to have it during Pesach?
Why have it 2 days before Pesach? This is a good
Yeah.
question. The electoral system in Israel is both incredibly efficient and organized. You have 9 million people. Let's say it's fewer because not everybody votes, but let's say you have somewhere around 6 million people voting on election day, and you're getting most of those results within 24 hours. That's a pretty impressive accomplishment. And so the election committee generally wants to operate under the mandate that it receives from Israel's basic laws, which means that if a government dissolves, that the election has to be within 3 months of its dissolution. So it dissolved on the one of the last days of December. I can't remember whether it was the 29th or the 30th. And so in principle, it needed to happen in March. Well, obviously it wouldn't happen on the Pesach holiday. Nobody would show up because Israelis are on vacation. They want to do other things. But you don't want it too early in March. That's not necessarily giving parties the time that they need to construct what kind of platforms they want to do. And there's a lot of internal jostling within the Israeli party system before election day. So you want everybody to have a fair campaign. So this was not necessarily ideal, but this is what was agreed upon. The good thing for Israelis is that election day is a national holiday. So nobody's going to work. A lot of people are going to go to the beach, that's for sure. And all of the party leaders are going to try to make sure that people vote between the beach and the park and whatever other, the shopping. There are a lot of sales And a lot of people, including myself at some point on election day, are going to be doing cleaning for Pesach, right? So between all of those things, you know, depending on your perspective, it could be a blessing in disguise. Oh, election day, that's great. I'll do my vote, and then I have the rest of the day to clean, and I don't have to take the day off from work. I don't know. It's definitely not ideal. Let's put it that way. But in accordance with the basic laws of Israel, this was essentially the best date of a bad bunch of dates in order to conduct the election. So we'll see. Any other questions?
Elliot, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. One of the previous speakers had talked about Netanyahu wooing the Arab votes and trying to get the Arabs out. So I'm confused though, and there may be other people know, but I don't. When you showed in the pie chart, the pie charts of the Arab block of people,
Mhm.
they don't get seats in the Knesset, but you're just showing. But what do you mean by?
They do.
I guess I'm confused by if they get seats in the Knesset, but they're not part of the government.
Okay, so it's a great question that you asked, and I'm happy to clarify. So the Knesset, the parliament, is 120 seats. And out of those 120 seats, only a portion of them, 61 plus, right, will be a part of the government itself, which means that the ministers and the parties are going to be with those parties, and that those parties are going to be leading government policy. Everybody else is in the opposition. So it's similar in some respects to the fact that you have at present you have a Congress which is majority Democrat, and the Speaker of the House is Democrat, and so the Congress is a Democrat Congress, and you have Democrat control over that body. The Parliament in Israel, the Knesset, is composed of both an opposition and the government and the government parties itself. So when I say that Arab parties have never been in the government, I mean that they've never been on the victor's side, in which they can be ministers and execute government policy. They're not sitting on the government cabinet in order to make national security decisions. Instead, historically, they've always been a part of the opposition. And that means that there are paths in which members of Knesset and the opposition can influence policy and can affect policy, and they can propose legislation. But the distinguishing factor here is that they're not a part of the government. They're not leading government policy or being a central actor within the formation of government policy. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, so it's really a matter, I guess, more semantics. I mean, they're in the government, they're just not in the majority party, and therefore they
Correct.
don't have any type of control or whatever.
Yeah, for the sake of example, right? In the most recent government, there was a ultra-Orthodox party that gets a couple of seats. They get 8 or 9 seats. They're not one of the biggest parties, but they have core constituents. And because that ultra-Orthodox party, that Haredi party, was a part of the government itself, the head of that party became the Minister of Health, right? And so the advantage to being a part of the government is that some of your members of Knesset will become government ministers. Maybe you'll be able to have a little bit of say over which ministry you take over. Maybe it's a special issue that's of importance to you or to your constituents, and you can have a little bit more of a say over how government policy on that particular issue is executed. If you're in the opposition, you can sit on subcommittees. Your voice will definitely be heard, but it's not your name and your stamp on the documents that are going to be sealed. So, ask anybody who is an Arab member of Knesset, and they would tell you that in an ideal world they would love to have the opportunity to affect policy, but the circumstances aren't right for it. It's not right for it because Arab parties have never been invited to be a part of the government, and depending on which Arab member of Knesset you're asking, they might also say to you, I wouldn't sit in and be a part of an Israeli government because of the enduring conflict with the Palestinians, etc. So depends on who you ask, but this is part of the reason why historically Arab parties have always been a part of the opposition.
Okay, another quick question, a little separate. The president of Israel, is that a separate election? It seems more like a figurehead. It seems, I mean, you know, you
Yeah.
never hear any controversy around the president.
Sure.
Can you explain that to me a little bit?
Sure. The president of Israel is a position that's been in existence since the founding of the state, but it's a symbolic status. The only kind of internal functional role that the president has is at the end of an election in which the president essentially listens to the parties in order to determine who receives the first mandate to construct a government. The presidential status, you know, as such, is because it's symbolic. There is no popular vote for the president. Rather, every 7 years, there's a internal vote held within the Knesset amongst 4 or 5 candidates, and that's how the president of the country is determined. For the most part, most presidents are former senior political figures who are kind of using, who enter the office of the presidency as a way to kind of, you know, ride off into the sunset. It doesn't mean that presidents don't have some kind of soft power capacity to influence policy. And, you know, depending on who the presidential figure is, they might have a particular issue or subject that they want to work on. And presidents, you know, also do some diplomacy. They'll travel around the world. They'll meet with other heads of state, and obviously they'll welcome heads of state when they come and visit Israel as well.
Okay, thank you.
Morris, you had a question?
Yes, just curiosity. The fact that the Arab population has never participated in the government is because in a hush-hush way, it has been considered security of the state matter. And of course, this is like walking on eggshells.
Yeah, there are certainly those within Israel who have always opposed Arab parties from joining the government because traditionally speaking, if you're a member of the government, if your party is a member of the government, then the head of that party is likely to be sitting on the national security cabinet. And there are parties in Israel who, and traditionally for many years, this was the case of both center left or center right parties, that they both felt that having that kind of representation would be a risk for national security. I'm not sure that is completely the case anymore amongst all of the parties of the center left. Certainly there are parties on the center right that still feel that way, but it's a nuanced conversation because obviously we've had Arab MKs, members of Knesset, who were not part of Arab parties, who have sat in the government and have been ministers in the government. So there is nuance there, and I do think that the conversation in Israel about Arab representation in the government is changing slowly. But this, as I mentioned, this election in particular there's been a dramatic shift in terms of outreach to the Arab community, both by opposition parties, but also by the leading party, the Likud party itself. So you know, there's a lot of embedded values that are part of the decision on both sides for not partaking in the government. But in theory, those things could change because those are more about cultural or political norms than about law. At least in accordance with Israeli law, there's nothing barring Arab parties from joining the government or barring Arab members of Knesset from holding senior positions within the government. It just hasn't happened up until now.
Thanks.
Any other questions?
I have a question if nobody else wants to ask. It's a personal question. You had mentioned that there are those who would rather have some government, whether it be the government of their choice or no government at all. How important is it to have a government, let's say that's with Bibi and Haredi, that exists over not having a government whatsoever? Because, you know, I go to the voting station on Tuesday and I can put my ballot in for Bibi and know that there's a chance there'll actually be a government. And if I don't, there's a chance there won't be a government. So
I think that there are definitely tangible reasons for voters to consider opting for stability over continued instability, right? And Israel's experienced a lot of instability over the last couple of years, political instability in particular. When we break down the polling data and we look at the certainty of respondents in terms of how sure they are that the response that they gave to the pollster is actually the party that they're going to vote for, the highest degree of voter certainty rests with parties that are located in the center right. Likud is over 70% certainty. The ultra-Orthodox parties are over 80% certainty. And more of the uncertainty are amongst center-left parties. Part of this is probably because center-left parties haven't distinguished in any particular way, but the difference is between a vote for one center-left party or one opposition party or a vote for another opposition party. And so there's a certain certainty amongst Netanyahu or let's say, pro-Netanyahu parties than there are amongst the opposition parties. There's, I think, at this point, because we're four elections into it, most people's perspectives are pretty baked in. You look at the polling data, Netanyahu has 44% favorability, but that means that there's 56% favorability, 56% that find him unfavorable, but that 56% is scattered amongst all the other options. So nobody has a clear alternative to Netanyahu, but there's a small majority of the country, a slight majority of the country does not favor Netanyahu and are not particularly pleased with him. But at this point, you can kind of like take any statistic and you can flip it both ways. The primary argument for somebody who is voting for Netanyahu or part of the Netanyahu camp is essentially, we've done this enough times. The economy, while stable, is essentially being paid off by future generations. The Pfizer vaccine is coming at a tremendous cost. The grants that have been handed out to the government, to small businesses, and to citizens is going to come at a greater cost later. We need a government in order to have a budget so that we can move on with our lives. The counter argument, of course, the argument of the opposition is, yes, but at what cost? Is it worth inviting parties on the far right who are associated with some of the racist elements within Israeli society? Are we okay with a government that associates itself with those kinds of values, with values that are of an extreme ideological and religious perspective? Is that the price that we're willing to pay for stability, right? And I think that ultimately it's going to be very, very close. I think that for many people, they prize stability over all things, and Netanyahu for them is the face of stability, right? Mr. Security, Mr. Economy. Look at what he's done on the international stage, right? Look at what he's accomplished in terms of delivering the vaccine to Israelis. And if you're in the opposition, you look at it and you say, look at the corruption, look at what Netanyahu has done to the rule of law, and Netanyahu himself is facing criminal charges, right? And these things are unforgivable, and we need to just move on, right? So in theory, right, we could have a scenario in which there is a new government formed that does not include Netanyahu, that is a sharing of power amongst multiple smaller parties, but the differences between those parties are vast. And it's at the very least, up until this point, no one has demonstrated any indication that they're willing to sacrifice on their values, on their kind of, ideological commitment to what they perceive as their camp, in order to remove Netanyahu from Israel's political landscape. So there's a good argument for voting for Netanyahu, and there's a good counter argument for voting against Netanyahu. And I think that that's part of the reason why a lot of the polling data has been very consistent, because the electorate has been divided, they've remained divided, and the margins are going to be, it's going to have to do with 10,000 people who decide, okay, we're going to vote today, or forget it, I'd rather spend time with my family, right? Or I'm concerned about potentially being exposed to COVID, and I'm not going to go to the voting booth, right? So it's really going to be close. Some more questions?
Yes. One thing that here probably we do not understand, and here I mean the United States. One thing is clear: the division between left and right in Israel is totally different to what we here in the United States have as left and right. Then the question is on the corruption definition. We know what corruption in the United States is. We know what corruption in the Latin American countries or some other countries in the Far East are. What is the definition of corruption in Israel?
Well, it's important to start by saying that, Netanyahu is indicted. He has not been found guilty of any of these charges. And his court cases,
what basically are his charges?
Well, one second. I'll get to it in a second. His court cases, which started in January and February and will continue in April, are essentially 3 separate cases in which he's being charged on fraud, breach of trust, and bribery. Each of these cases are different in terms of the kind of makeup and the actors who are involved, and what the prime minister is being accused of. So I don't know whether I think that corruption is corruption, right? The real question within the Israeli electorate is, are the charges real, or are they not really all that serious, right? I think in general, the Israeli public takes legal situations and the law quite seriously. Israel is maybe in some regards unique in that sense, where you have had multiple heads of state accused and eventually, in some cases, charged of criminal acts, including former Prime Minister Ehud Olmert. There were charges also levied against the late Prime Minister Ariel Sharon, but those charges did not continue because he fell into a coma. There were charges levied against the former president of Israel, Moshe Katsav, for sexual harassment and abuse. So Israel's legal system is very robust, and there's a fairly high degree of public trust in both the police, the attorney general, and state prosecution. But the real question is whether you feel like the prime minister of the country can still do his job while being, enduring court cases, or whether you feel if the prime minister is indicted, that itself is a red line. He should step down, he or she should step down and let somebody take over. And then once the court cases are done with, and if he's acquitted, then he can, go back into public life. That's a question to which there is no straight legal answer. Some countries, France, for example, has a legal system in which if you enter public office and at some point there are charges levied against you, those charges and those court proceedings are delayed until after you exit public life, right? So every country has its own system. Israel's system has not prevented people from entering the courtroom while sitting in public office, but it's a political issue in Israel. There are some parties and some people who feel like this is a red line, you should step down, and there are people who don't. So I'm not a legal expert. I've not sat in the courtroom and I'm not privy to all of the evidence. I can't make a judgment as to whether these charges will at some point years, in some court cases can last years. So in theory, we may not know the results of any of these cases for maybe 2 or 3 years down the road. I have no way of being able to say clearly, guilty or not guilty. It's more of a question of whether you feel like the prime minister of the country can be prime minister if indicted, and if so, how? And if not so, then how should that individual be removed from office? Ballot box or by the legislative branch. So that's really the core of the debate. I can't really answer to whether the charges themselves have teeth, or whether in 2 years' time he'll be acquitted. You should ask a lawyer. I'm not the person to answer that
Okay,
question.
but being specifically, and of course, with you not taking any sides and trying to be as impartial as possible, could you let us know or tell us what are the specific alleged accusations?
They don't.
Yeah. Yes. There's one case in which he's been accused of taking bribes from a Israeli, I don't know whether he's a billionaire or a multimillionaire, but let's just say a very wealthy Israeli individual, gifts of champagne, cigars, and other effects to that matter, physical gifts. There's another case in which he's being charged for brokering a deal with the owners of one of Israel's largest news agencies in exchange for essentially changing Israel's communications laws in exchange for favorable coverage. And I'm trying to remember the fourth case. The fourth case is also, an accusation of along similar lines of taking some kind of bribe, right? But once again, not all of the cases are equal. Some of the cases, it's about breach of trust, which means how he responded or engaged with the police during the investigations. And some of the charges are for bribery, right? So each case will be dealt with separately. And some of the cases could be completed within 2 years. Some of them could go on for more, right? It all depends on the proceedings. Israel's legal system is efficient to a degree, but he's also the prime minister of the country. So long as he's prime minister of the country, that process will also kind of take into consideration his workload and his ability and the ability of witnesses to appear before a court. So yeah, I saw a question from
Judith has a question.
It's a multi-part question. I'm trying to understand how the government is formed. And first part is, when you're voting for Netanyahu's party or whatever, is it a block vote when they say they need 31 votes? And are these people who become part of the Knesset, are how are they chosen? That's
Mhm.
number one. And number two, are they, as part of that, are they chosen regionally? In other words, are certain areas, Jerusalem, Tel Aviv, Haifa, whatever, more supportive of different parties? But I have trouble understanding the parliamentary system as, differentiating it from England versus Israel. So it's convoluted, but if you could try to answer that, I'd appreciate it.
Absolutely. The Israeli system is loosely based off of the British system, but obviously you can tell that the British system has a certain degree of built-in stability because even though it's a multi-party system, in Britain, it's usually, you're talking about 4 or 5, maybe 6 parties. And in Israel, traditionally, you're talking about more like 10, 12 or more. So in essence, right, if you have the largest party, let's say you are Bibi Netanyahu and you wake up the morning of March 24th and you have 31 seats, you're the largest party. Odds are you're going to be given the mandate to try to construct a government. Then you need a government of minimally 61 seats. Let's say you have 30, so you need another 31. Where are you going to find them? So they're natural allies. You know that some of the parties out there are going to join you. In fact, some of parties have already pledged their loyalty to Netanyahu. So you know that the ultra-Orthodox parties are going to join. You don't have to really pick up the phone and call. Afterwards, you know that you're going to have to decide what ministries you're going to give them, but you know that you're pretty much safe with them. Who else are you going to go out there and find? Well, maybe you can find, one of the parties that claims that it was an opposition party. Maybe you can find a way to sweeten the deal. You offer them the Ministry of Defense. That's typically considered a number 2 position. You offer them the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. You offer them ministries, or you can offer them various policy issues. Maybe you'll basically trade off issues in order to get them to recommend you or to join your government. So there's a lot of horse trading, to put it really simply, of values and pieces of the government in order to build a coalition government. It's a built-in part of the game, so to speak. We have never had a party win 61 seats all on its own. So no matter what, in Israeli politics, you always have to sacrifice a little bit, whether it's your values or your influence, in order to draw other parties into your coalition. Those parties could have been your worst enemies just days beforehand, and yet for the sake of building a government, you'll do it. It's interesting to find which values people end up sacrificing after election day. And that's one of the interesting things about the Israeli parliamentary system, is that post-election there can be a real gap between the party's actions and their constituency, especially if it's a new party in which that came out of existence 2 months ago. Who are their constituents? How much do they feel beholden to them? It really depends. Whereas some of the core parties, the traditional parties, Likud party, for example, or the Labour Party, has a core constituency, and they'll let you know, right? They'll let you know about it if you violate, the public trust of voters for that party. And I think that ties in directly to how people are chosen to be within the parties themselves. Some parties in Israel have a primary system. And so let's say you're you're a Likud party voter. You've been a Likud party voter for 40 years. Then there's going to be a primary before the election. You can, go and vote in the primary if you're a party member, although a lot of party members don't actually vote in the primaries, but you have the choice of doing so. And basically, you're going to get a giant list. And on the giant list, there's going to be, 100, 200 names. And you're going to put your votes in, whatever. And they create the list based on how the results of the primary vote. So if you got the 40th highest number on the list, then you're the 40th person on the list, which means if your party gets 40 seats, then you're in the government, right? You're in the Knesset. And if you're the 5th on the list, oh, that's much better. Odds are you're probably going to be in the government, right? So the list is predetermined before election day, and you can't really move a lot of things after that. Some parties don't have primaries. And so the party leader or leaders, depending on the party construction, will predetermine the list 1 to 120, just in case they win all of the seats in the Knesset. And that list will be available to the public. Most times, parties aren't necessarily looking for leadership within the party based on a particular region of the country. Obviously, the big, larger parties want to have diversity, and diversity is important if you're, really hoping to win a national election. But it really depends on the party. So the Likud party, Likud's party list, for example, includes, not complete gender diversity, but there is more gender balance, certainly at the top of the list. They'll always have an Arab on their list. They'll have maybe an Ethiopian on their list. Maybe they'll have a Christian on their list. You kind of want to have a little bit of diversity there. But some parties are single constituency parties. They're basically representing communities in Israel that perceive and identify themselves as being minority communities. So for the sake of example, an ultra-Orthodox party will be represented only by ultra-Orthodox Jews and only ultra-Orthodox men, right? Reflective of the values of that community, right? And the leadership of that party will be determined by rabbinic leadership of that community, who are deciding and not an internal vote within the party structure. So each party system, internal system, operates and works a little bit different. But you did say something about regional flavors, and I do think that different regions of the country vote with different patterns. Tel Aviv is where you're going to see the largest concentrations of voters for center-left parties, right? And it's important to identify, once, as it was mentioned by, I think, Morris, that left and right in Israel have different meanings than left and right in the United States. Although I do think that in some issues, the gaps have narrowed a little bit, but we're largely talking about, in Tel Aviv, you're going to see a large concentration of labor voters. You're going to see a large concentration of Meretz voters, Meretz being the equivalent to Israel's most progressive left-wing party. You're going to see a large concentration of Yesh Atid voters. In Jerusalem, by contrast, Jerusalem is 30% Haredi. You're going to see a high concentration of United Torah Judaism, which is one of the large Haredi parties, and you're going to see a large concentration of Shas voters, which is another Haredi party, right? And you're going to get a mix of all those other stuff. So depending on where you live in the country, your community might be flavored more with one party's representatives than another. But once again, it's a national election, so it doesn't necessarily matter if you're in a community that's more one way or more the other way. Ultimately, all the votes are equal and they're all tallied equal and they all affect everyone equally. Yeah, those are great questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah.
Anybody else? Okay. Very good. Gabi, thank you so much
you,
for joining
yes.
us. This was fascinating.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hug
Thank all of
Sameach.
you.
Yes.
Cast your vote.
Thank you.
Good
Thank
luck.
you. I'm looking forward to it, and afterwards I will immediately go and make a barbecue. And after that, maybe I'll do some Pesach cleaning. Obviously, if this is the third in your series, then you've patiently listened to a number of different perspectives. Israel has a really, really wide and diverse society, and so I recommend, if this is a topic that still interests you, to maybe over the next day or so take a look at some of the articles that are being published in some of the English language newspapers, or if your Hebrew is good enough, in some of the Hebrew newspapers, and follow the results, because as I mentioned, it's going to be very close. It could go one way, it could go the other, or it could go nowhere. So all of the options are on the table, and it's going to be an ongoing drama over the next couple of weeks. It'll be interesting to see how it plays out.
Okay, great.
Thanks so much,
Thank
Gabi.
you. Thanks to all of you. Chag Sameach in
you.
advance.
Chag
Happy
Sameach.
holidays.
Everybody have
Bye.
a great rest of your day.
Thank you, Beth. Thank you, Cantor Lieberman also.
Yes.